Good day, economic students. The purpose of this video is to use our tools of supply and demand learned in class to analyze the housing markets. Typically, economists identify three factors which have a significant impact on the housing market. The first one is interest rates. Our nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve, controls the nation's money supply and therefore controls interest rates. During an economic downturn, the Federal Reserve would desire lower interest rates to make it easier for businesses to borrow and invest in new machines and equipment in factories, and for individuals like you and I to buy houses and cars. During an economic expansion, the Fed would tend to increase interest rates by decreasing the money supply to make certain that the economic expansion stays in check without causing too much inflation. As far as the housing market is concerned, interest rates have a significant impact on the cost of borrowing and therefore the cost of owning a home over time, especially when you consider that the average buyer finances a home for typically 15, 20, or 30 years. So changes in interest rates will definitely impact how much money people will qualify for when purchasing a home and the cost of owning that home over time. The second factor is the regulatory environment. The United States has just recovered from a significant housing downturn, a collapse, a bubble, caused mostly by deregulation of the financial industry and laxed lending standards for mortgage applications. After the housing collapse, the United States government passed a bill called the Dodd-Frank bill, which significantly increased the factors necessary for an individual to qualify for a mortgage and made the lending environment much more stringent. So it's much more difficult to qualify for a mortgage these days. However, the Trump administration is considering rolling back Dodd-Frank, or at least some of the requirements, which may make it easier for the average person to qualify for borrowing and for a mortgage. The third factor is pretty straightforward: the economic outlook. During economic good times or economic expansions, people have jobs, more money to spend, feel better about their economic situation, and tend to buy more homes. And during economic downturns, the opposite is true. Let's investigate this first factor, interest rates. If you consider Sally, who is purchasing a $200,000 home, and she doesn't have $200,000 in cash, she's going to finance a significant amount of the home purchase. She's going to put down a $25,000 down payment on the house and finance $175,000, and she's going to finance this house for 30 years. So $175,000 mortgage, it's a 30-year mortgage, it's a 30-year fixed mortgage, meaning that her payment will be the same for the next 360 months, and her payment includes both her principal and interest. You can see on this slide the difference between a 4% and a 5% interest rate on that 30-year mortgage. At 4%, her cost per month is $836 for principal and interest. A 1% increase in the interest rate increases the cost of owning that home by $104 per month. Now, $104 doesn't sound much for 1 month, but over the course of 30 years, that's a significant increase in the cost of owning that home. In 2013, Ben Bernanke, who was then the Federal Reserve Chair, announced that the Federal Reserve was going to be rolling back some of its quantitative easing. In layman's terms, the Federal Reserve was going to make the money supply a little less available, also known as Fed tightening. This announcement caused interest rates to increase by 1% in 6 months. The increase in interest rates was a non-price determinant of demand. You could either call it taste and preferences or prices of related goods, in this case, the cost of borrowing. The decrease in demand changed the equilibrium in the housing market from E1 to E2. At E2, you can see prices of average homes dropped from P1 to P2, and the quantity of houses purchased and sold actually also fell. Now, interest rates have risen since Donald Trump won the presidency in November. You would think that this would decrease the demand as explained in the previous slide. However, as I mentioned before, there is a serious possibility that the regulatory environment changes under the Trump administration. If more people qualify for mortgage because lending standards are laxed a bit, this is going to increase the number of buyers. An increase in the number of buyers will shift the demand curve to the right, and that would tend to change equilibrium from E1 to E2, where more houses are purchased and the average housing price increases. The last factor to consider when evaluating the housing market is the supply side of the equation. On the left, we have a graph of a relatively inelastic supply curve. On the right, a relatively elastic supply curve. Although this is a macroeconomics class, and we will not be discussing elasticity in too much detail, it is relevant for this discussion. A relatively inelastic supply curve simply means that sellers cannot make a large number of units available for sale in a short amount of time. In other words, it's difficult to change the production level of the good or service in question. And this is typical of the housing industry. If you consider how long it takes to develop a new housing project and build homes, and if you also consider that current homeowners don't necessarily need to sell their homes, which means that the supply of existing homes may not change much, typically we think of housing as relatively inelastic during economic good times. And that's exactly what's been taking place since the housing recovery. The housing market has experienced a relatively inelastic supply of homes. Now, if you compare the graph on the left, one inelastic supply, with the graph on the right, elastic supply, you can see what's going to happen when there's an increase in demand. Assume that the regulatory environment gets more friendly for potential home buyers. This creates an increase in demand from D1 to D2 in both graphs. Notice that price increases in both graphs. However, if we assume that there's a relatively inelastic supply of houses, if that reflects the current housing market, the increase in demand will have a much more significant increase in the average home prices. Things to look for when analyzing the housing market.